Yes, my name is Kevin Hyland, and my capacity today is representing the Santa Marta Group, which is a group which is bringing civil society, law enforcement, legislators internationally together. And it was launched in 2014 at the Vatican by Pope Francis, with now representation from over 35 countries as participants.
Could you just say something also just about briefly about your history, your professional history?
Yes, I was a police officer for 30 years, working in London, the West Midlands, Devon and Cornwall, and finishing in London, running the Metropolitan Police and developing the Metropolitan Police human trafficking teams. My experience includes working on sexual offences and particularly women who have been victims of abuse and sexual crimes. And then I was appointed by Theresa May as the first independent anti-slavery commissioner between 2014 and 2018, spearheading UK's responses to human trafficking, including oversight of the national referral mechanism and the international aspects of prevention of trafficking.
Thank you. So there's no surprise that we want to then talk to you specifically about, or particularly about Article 6 of CEDAW and General Recommendations 19, 26 and 38, although we may not go into the detail of each of the recommendations. You've said in your witness statement that that it's your belief that the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, has not achieved its purpose. Can you just explain specifically about what would have been different if we'd had CEDAW implemented or domesticated?
Yes, well, the National Referral Mechanism, just to give some overview, came out of the UN Convention on Trafficking, or the UN Protocol on Trafficking, the Palermo Protocol, which dates back to 2000, and the Council of Europe, their convention, which came into effect in 2006 and was ratified by the UK in 2009. So that actually provides and sets out what a country should do in order to have a national referral mechanism, and that should be a proactive system for identifying and supporting victims of human trafficking, and has specific areas relating to women and girls and how they should be responded to, particularly looking at gender issues, at the differences of support that they need, and the periods of time that they need. And for example, when we're talking about women, pregnant women, women who have been raped, women who have been subject of abuse and domestic abuse while trafficked, or have been actually targeted because they are women and girls, because we know in some parts of the world they're seen as a commodity. So I think if this was part of CEDAW and, as you're terming it, a Bill of Rights, and it was part of the forming of an NRM, I think that all the considerations for women and girls issues would be much greater. And if I can give you an example of where the failings are, published this year is the guidance by the Home Office on what an NRM is. And it sets out what vulnerable people should be allowed. And in that vulnerable people, it relates to pregnant women. And pregnant women are entitled to an extra £3 a week because they're pregnant. And that is a shocking amount, as we might all agree. But then it goes on to decide what a vulnerable person is, and it says people over 60 and pregnant women, and it says they may get access to healthcare and health support. It doesn't say they will or they must. So I don't see how any policy that is written about women and about pregnant women in particular on the NRM could be lumped into the same group as people over 60. And I think that shows where the shortfalls on the NRM is. And actually, if you look at the NRM policy that is produced by the Home Office, there is no reference really about women and girls and their special needs and how they may be affected, and the fact that many of them will be subject to sexual abuse. It mentions things in passing, but there's no detail or no policy approach that really supports women and girls.
Given the numbers of women and girls who are victims of trafficking, that seems to be quite a shocking omission in any sort of meaningful strategy. Would you say that what's the real accountability then of the NRM in terms of it discharging the UK's responsibility?
Well, the NRM was managed by two different agencies. One was the UK Border force or border agency, and that was looking at people who were undocumented or had immigration issues. And there was the issue of those who don't have documentary issues and are legally allowed to reside in the UK, which was done by the National Crime Agency. That has now all been absorbed into the Home Office. Now, since they have taken responsibility, it looks good, and it is good that we're getting more referrals into the process. And last year it was just, I think it was 10,600, and the year before it was just over that amount. There was a reduction in numbers, but a very small amount due to COVID. But of those now 20,000 that have gone in the last 2 years, there are still 18,600 waiting for decisions, and that doesn't include the new ones that have gone in 2021. And there are some from before 2019. So the system is not working. The system is that people are going into this process. And if we look back to, say, 2014, there was only 2,600 that were referred into the NRM. So it's gone up a very large amount since then. But I think it was about, 1,150 had positive decisions, they were seen as victims, which was, I think, around 47%. Last year, it was 17% got positive decisions, which is spread over 2 years now. So the system is failing. And in that system, we have lots of women and girls. We have women who are pregnant, who may have been raped by their trafficker. We have women ending up in inappropriate accommodation or support. There is only accommodation for about 600 or 700 victims in the system. So where are the other 18,000 or so? So there is no accountability. And if somebody gets a negative grounds decision, something I pushed for as commissioner was there needs to be an appeal process. Now they've brought up an appeals panel, as it were, or an oversight panel to look at negative decisions, but it has no statutory footing. It has no power to veto a decision made by the Home Office. So in a way, it's a lip service. So when I see, a strategy and a plan, which was produced only this month, talking about, £3 for a pregnant woman, they may be entitled to support and NHS support. It recognises that most pregnant women who are trafficked only go for antenatal on their third semester. And, when we see all these things and there is no positive policy of response, it is all kind of just pushing it elsewhere. And so I think there needs to be accountability. And I think something like a Bill of Rights, something like CEDAW could be that oversight function.
Thank you very much. And you've identified the particular shortcomings in if you have only accommodation for 600 or 700 trafficking victims, then you're never going to be able to accommodate those who may properly fall within the positive identification framework. I wanted to just move on. Sorry, I know this is quite truncated, but we've got quite a lot of things we want to cover.
Yeah.
The other issue, a particular issue I wanted to deal with, was the mechanisms and systems in place to protect women from violence in the UK. And you said in your witness statement at paragraph 2 for the judge's note that there is a need of an overhaul, and then you specifically referenced the lack of convictions in the UK for rape. And I notice, of course, that we've just had the government waking up to that or reporting back on that. Again, just trying to focus it on what CEDAW could bring if it were implemented, and if the problem is substantive as well as procedural, what your response to or what your recommendation might be in light of that statistic.
So one of the biggest problems, as was in my statement, is the low number of convictions in rape cases and domestic violence, and for victims of women and girls victims of crime. And I think some of that is down to, certainly down to law enforcement. It is my old organisations, but I think we have to be honest that, there isn't much kudos or much investment on these types of crimes. You will hear there is, and you will hear there's new teams being set up and new units being set up. But if you were to look at the investment, say, on counterterrorism, or the investment on firearms crime or other gangland crime, it's a constant investment. It is seen as very high risk. It's seen as something that has to be dealt with. Whereas on the other hand, these kind of other crimes, I think years ago they did have a greater standing, and we were getting to that point where we did start setting up, well-funded teams. But I think it slipped off the radar. And I think also that, there isn't the investigative techniques being used that you would get in other crimes, particularly serious crimes. And so therefore it's a very superficial response. And I think that is being shown out by the conviction rates. And I think that's the same with trafficking. We see very low conviction rates in trafficking, but, there were cases that I was dealing with when I was running the teams in Scotland Yard that some of them were many years old. I remember taking on an investigation which had involved two different police forces, 3 different departments in those police forces. And it was kind of a game of tennis. And I brought it all together and we convicted the rapist and the people who were involved in the trafficking. And that meant having to go to India to get evidence. So it was possible, albeit that case had been written off. And, I'd seen the same when we were dealing with children, girls being trafficked for, sexual exploitation across, several counties. And it's about the focus of this being a serious crime and what is required and the responses necessary. And that's why I think that, having something like a Bill of Rights where policing at a local level or a police force level and a local level would be held account by a form of legislation that is specific for women and is actually something that can, have some teeth to actually ask police chiefs and alike, what is it you're doing here, and build up a framework of accountability and metrics to measure their success or otherwise. Because we can't have it whereby, the figures that were produced yesterday just show that there is nothing that is actually, women may be looking for remedy, and it's very little, particularly through the criminal justice system, but also through compensation, and the criminals act with impunity. So I think that until those 2 areas are addressed, and the Bill of Rights could be an excellent way of achieving that.
So from what you say, there's a lack of political will and a lack of any commitment to dedicating the kind of resources and prioritizing that area of criminal investigation, which has a detrimental effect, obviously, on women.
Yes, and I think, the area is a tough area to work in. Let's not, there are some outstanding police officers working in this area, and the area is, very hard to work in, particularly with the amount of work that may come in, but that needs to be managed, resourced and prioritized. And without those, you will have a few good individuals doing as best they can, but not in a structured and a policy driven way.
Thank you. I wanted to move on to a third area, if I may, which is about about sexual abuse in schools and colleges, and in light of the recent Ofsted review, again of this month, and whether as a police officer you had experience of having such abuse cases reported to you, and what you think of the failures to identify and prioritize these crimes by schools and therefore by the investigating authorities.
Yes, I can, some of the experience I've got goes back to, the 90s or the early 90s. But I do recall, where a case was reported to us in the West Midlands area of a school where there was systemic child abuse, some of it historic, and there was no interest in it, really. There was absolutely no interest. And it was just because there was a, dedicated team of which I was part that, went against the grain, as it were, to a degree. And we investigated and convicted, it was a special needs school. And so, has that changed? I'm sure it has changed with, the safeguarding legislation and the policy changes that are there. But is there the, commitment? And I saw this with trafficking, that, when we had cases of trafficking that may be connected to schools, schools were lost on this. And if they had a child there that may have been trafficked or they thought was trafficked, in Scotland, there is a process where every child has to be tracked and everyone has to report on where a child is. That wasn't available in England and Wales. So, the emphasis on reporting, the emphasis on what happens, and the resources that are available to then look at it in a joined up way, I think are still way too low compared to other crimes.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you also about treatment of women in prison and what your experience of that is in the context of your previous and current roles, and again, what CEDAW could do to redress or achieve redress for women in prison.
Yes, and not in the UK jurisdiction, but in Ireland, I'm actually looking at prisons, but that's something different. But what I do see with those, and particularly when I was in law enforcement, and issues, for example, like women generally go into prison for relatively minor crimes compared to men, and they will be highly likely to be non-violent crimes. Not saying that there aren't, but they will be non-violent crimes. And for example, women in prostitution, I could never understand why women in prostitution would be arrested on the streets, and then it's an offence that has a fine only. They then end up at court, and then they get a warrant issued for their failing to appear, and this may be on several occasions, and then that is notched up into a custodial sentence for non-payment of fines and for failing to appear, and they go to prison. And so we spend thousands and probably tens of thousands for what was a minor offence, and there's no alternatives. Something was tried in South London where it was diversion courts, which was quite successful. What was introduced by a woman who had been trafficked and in prostitution herself, Diane Martin, who now is representing the OSCE as an advisor as a traffic victim. But nothing is thought through, and this has been something for a long time. And also remand. When women are placed on remand, I've seen the argument, should men and women be looked at differently? But we look at people in their own personal circumstances. That's what our judicial system is about, or our criminal justice system is about. Who else gets affected by a woman being placed on remand? The whole family can be affected. The children can be affected. And we need to really consider that when we are considering particularly crimes that are not, serious crimes or not crimes of violence. I realize there's maybe some, but if you actually look at the kind of crimes women are in prison for, I would say, in my experience, they very rarely justify, detention prior to any conviction.
And we obviously had some of the recommendations from the Corsten review and the feedback from that, which haven't been implemented or fully implemented.
The recommendations, the general recommendations 2019 and 26 specifically deal with the issue of migrant women and difficulties that they experience with trafficking as part and parcel of their migration status. And I wonder if you have any comments on the position of migrant women and trafficking. Overseas domestic workers in particular was what I was thinking about.
Yes, well, I think overall with the shift we're seeing on migration policy in the UK and legislation, I think that overall is going to be extremely detrimental to victims of trafficking. And if we look at the the issues, particularly of women and girls who will be suffering in silence, I think the challenges for them are going to be far more enhanced than those of men. And I've seen that firsthand, whether I've been in Nigeria, whether I've been in Italy and Greece, or northern France, and many other places in the world. And these are people whose destination was Europe or the UK in particular. And when you speak with mothers, who have, in Nigeria, mothers whose daughters are heading off to the UK, and they believe they're going to London with the streets paved of gold, and when they get there, they become a commodity exploited. With our new policy approach around immigration, it could be that they are just actually put back on a plane within short period of time, particularly if they don't cooperate with the authorities. And the NRM is all about, assisting, even if people don't cooperate. So this new immigration process could be extremely harmful. And I call it, in a way, it's detrimental to victims, and it's almost a chartered for victims, for criminals, because I saw it in northern France where the criminals were operating with impunity. And I met a mother, who'd placed her baby in the back of a lorry. And, you know, if we think about that, you know, this was a Syrian woman. Why would someone place their baby with somebody they'd never met? But it's because she truly felt that if her baby stayed there in Europe, that the baby might get killed. And she felt that at least the child had a chance of living. That's what we're creating. That is what we are creating with our new legislation in the UK. Going on to what you asked about, the domestic workers, a policy was brought in whereby they're supposed to be supported and given options to stay, and it's part of the legal framework in the Modern Slavery Act as well. But it hasn't been implemented. There were supposed to be measures for before they leave their country. They were supposed to be given, a training package. There was supposed to be legislation brought in and policy brought in about, the people who bring the domestic workers in. So it's not been implemented properly. And I think all these policies have really raised the risks for them as well, the domestic workers, who will be particularly in premises like, inside diplomatic households and very wealthy households.
Thank you.
Just one final observation before I hand over to the judges, which is that all the areas you've described, it seems to me, identify intersectional concerns that could be addressed by CEDAW. So women and migration status, women and race. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's what CEDAW could do with all these areas of risk to women and girls and where they are vulnerable. There is no joined up. If you looked at rape policy and trafficking policy and domestic violence policy and all of those, they all sit very differently. And, and sort of the many issues that might be in them, like, domestic workers, pregnant women, girls, all of those, education. And I think that's what's needed. We need to go back and identify where are the areas, education, we need to, criminal justice access, remedy, all the areas that are relevant to women and girls who are victims of crime, or in my case, when I talk about it, victims of trafficking. Bringing that all together could be a perfect fit for a CEDAW.
Thank you very much.